thought, you know what, it's cold, it's snowing, I just want to get my kid home safe and we'll deal with this tomorrow. So she agreed to pick him up. She hopped in the car and began driving to this gas station, and as she's driving, she gets another call from her son. This time, he sounds totally panicked and scared, and he's asking his mom, you know, where are you? Where are you, Mom? And she's telling him, I'm going to be there in a minute. I'm just down the road. Calm down. I'll be there in a minute. And then he hung up. When she got to the gas station, he wasn't there. When she tried calling him back, his phone was off. She got out of the car and went into the gas station and asked if they'd seen her son, and they said they hadn't. She got back in the car and she drove around for about 30 minutes yelling for her son, but there was no sign of him. She still couldn't get in touch with him. His phone was still off, and she just had this bad feeling that something had happened to him, so she called the police. The police conducted a thorough search that started with the house Dylan had been at for this party. They interviewed the people who were there, and everybody said Dylan seemed fine, and he just left. He said he was getting picked up by his mom. But as they looked around town, they just could not find any sign of him. 10 days later, Dylan's body was found in an area nobody was searching. In fact, he was found by accident by two people that crashed their ATVs in the middle of the night and then went back in the daytime the next day to retrieve their ATVs, and that's when they found Dylan's body. He was located outside of town, high up a hill in a dense forest, which in order to get there, he would have had to walk the opposite direction of the gas station. Now, toxicology reports showed Dylan had been under the influence of alcohol, but this was his hometown. He certainly knew where the gas station was, and he would have known he was walking in the complete wrong direction, especially when you consider walking towards the gas station was like walking towards the center of town. There was lots of lights, lots of indication you're going in the right direction. To walk in the other direction towards the hill where he was found would have been like walking towards darkness. There's no lights, there's no sign of town. It's obviously the wrong direction. But the case gets even stranger, because on the day Dylan was missing, there was a lot of snow on the ground, which meant people would have made tracks. And from the time Dylan went missing until he was found, it didn't snow, and the temperature did not heat up enough to melt the snow. So in theory, any tracks Dylan would have made, it would still be there when he was found. But where Dylan was found, there were no tracks anywhere near him. Footprints, tire tracks, nothing. It was as if someone had dropped him out of the sky. Another strange element of this case is Dylan was found without pants and with boots on. And so you would think for him to make it all the way up to this spot on the hillside through rough, rocky, snowy terrain, through a forest, that you would expect his socks to be totally ruined and his feet to potentially be cut up. But his socks were clean and his feet were uninjured. This led investigators to believe Dylan must have somehow made his way to that spot on the hillside in that forest without leaving any tracks, and then once he was there, he removed his pants and his boots. Except dozens of police officers and sniffer dogs were never able to find those pants and boots, despite the fact they should, in theory, be in that immediate area where he took them off. While he determined Dylan's cause of death to be hypothermia, the deputy coroner, David Roos, was convinced there was something off about this case. After local authorities came out and said Dylan's death was an accident, David became very vocal in the media saying he disagreed, and he thought Dylan had been attacked. But the county never reinvestigated Dylan's case, and in fact, they went on to fire David Roos, the coroner, saying he was no longer qualified to do the job. David says they fired him to keep him quiet. As a result, we may never know the truth about what happened to Dylan. Dustin Self was born and raised in Piedmont, Oklahoma, which is a small community just northwest of Oklahoma City. Growing up, Dustin had always been kind of a mediocre performer with so-so grades, didn't take things too seriously, but in his senior year, he discovered weightlifting, and it seemed to give his life a much-needed sense of purpose, and it really kind of helped him organize all aspects of his life. So by the time he was graduating, he was not only in great physical shape, he had also managed to raise all of his grades up significantly, and he seemed to be on a path to success. But interestingly, after high school, he didn't pursue higher education, he didn't go get a job, he didn't try to spend more time with friends and family. Instead, he decided he wanted to go live in the wild. His family believed this was due to his obsession with the Hollywood film Into the Wild, which is about the true story of Christopher McCandless, who gives up a promising career to go live off in the wilds of Alaska. Christopher would ultimately die in the wilds of Alaska after eating a poisonous plant, or some say he died from starvation. So about a year after Dustin's high school graduation, he was 19 years old, it was March of 2013, he finally felt like he was ready to go live out this dream of living in the wild. And so he told his family he was going to go on this cross-country road trip, stopping at different points along the way, living out in the woods. His family knew he was really fixated on this and couldn't talk him out of it, and so they ultimately accepted it and said, just be really careful. So in early March, Dustin heads out on this road trip, and nobody hears from him until March 15th, when he calls his parents and says, I'm in this tiny town called Fields, Oregon, and I'm at a gas station. Everything's going great, nothing to worry about. The very next day, Dustin called his ex-girlfriend and told her he was lost on a mountain. And his ex-girlfriend said she couldn't really understand what he was saying, and she was actually at the airport about to board a plane, so it was noisy, and she stepped into a bathroom to hear him more clearly, but even as she's hearing him, what he was saying just wasn't making any sense. He was talking about this mountain he was lost on, and he was referencing that there were people that were after him, and it was just very confusing, and before she could get any more clarifying information from Dustin, he hung up, and then she couldn't get back in touch with him. So she calls Dustin's father, and she tells him that she had this really weird conversation with Dustin, where he said he's lost on this mountain, and even though I didn't really understand what he was telling me, he sounded really, really scared. Dustin's father thanked her and then spent the rest of the day trying to get in touch with his son, but every time he called, it just went straight to voicemail. The next day, when he still hadn't heard from his son, he called the police. The police did not have a great idea of where to start looking for him because Dustin did not specify to his ex-girlfriend what mountain he was actually lost on. All they had was his last known location, which was that gas station in Fields, Oregon. So they went to that gas station and he wasn't there, and they asked the people that worked there if they remembered Dustin, and they didn't, and no one knew anything about him. And so after that, they just had to wait for more leads to come in because they couldn't just, search all the mountains in Oregon for Dustin. They would never find him. A month later, after no one's heard from Dustin, a ranch hand who was living in a very rural section of Oregon, not far from the gas station in Fields, Oregon, discovered Dustin's truck parked precariously on the edge of this road inside of a canyon. It was abandoned, but inside were Dustin's GPS, some food, and some energy drinks. His backpack that contained his sleeping bag and his tent were missing. There was a comprehensive search done around where the truck had been found, but after a couple of days, nothing had been found and the search was terminated. The area around where Dustin's truck was found was very hilly and rocky, but there weren't that many trees, which meant if you were standing on one of the different mountains in an area, you'd be able to very easily look out and actually see a road. And so the searchers were thinking to themselves, how could this guy have gotten lost on any of these mountains? Because all he'd have to do is look over there and there's a road and therefore there's help. 6 months later, a hunter was up in those mountains near where Dustin's truck was found, and he was actually moving through one of these small sections of aspen trees, and as he was walking through, he thought he saw a deer, and he was kind of stalking through these trees, and he gets to an opening where he looks down and he stops, because underneath the bush is an obviously dead man not wearing any clothes, who's on his hands and knees, and it looks like his head is stuck in the ground. When the hunter walks over to get a better look, it looks like this guy must have pushed his head into a hole in the ground before he succumbed to whatever killed him. The hunter leaves and tells police. Police show up, they search the area, and they find a jacket nearby, inside of which is a wallet that contains Dustin's ID cards, as well as Dustin's car keys. The body was Dustin's. Dustin was located 9 miles away from where his truck had been parked on that road, and nowhere in the area did they find a campsite. They actually never found his backpack that contained the tent or the sleeping bag, so they think he never set up camp, but they don't know where his supplies went. After Dustin's family found out what happened to him, his father would say, I just don't understand why he didn't seek shelter in his vehicle. It was parked on the road, he wasn't that far away, and he could have run those 9 miles. He was in great physical shape, and in theory, he would have known where he parked it, or if he didn't, he could have just walked to the edge of the mountain and looked out and seen the road it was parked on. So the family just couldn't understand his decision making. Investigators would say there was no indication Dustin was trying to hurt himself and foul play was ruled out. So what was it that caused Dustin to abandon his car and walk 9 miles uphill and ditch his clothes and ditch his backpack that contained his tent and his sleeping bag, and then stick his head in a hole until he died? The only thing that could be determined was that Dustin probably died of hypothermia, but because of the state his body was in from decomposition, the coroner said we don't know for sure. So like all the other missing 411 cases, we're left with lots of questions and not a lot of answers. In 2010, Jan McAbee was living with her husband Bruce in a town called Lima, Ohio, which is approximately 80 miles southwest of Lake Erie. While Jan had built a successful career as a booking agent for musicians, bands, and entertainers, her real passion was deer hunting. So, on September 29th of that year, right after deer hunting season in Oakland, Ohio, Jan decided to go out and hunt. That morning had been cold and damp and gray, but by that afternoon, when Jan was getting ready to go, the temperatures had risen and the sun had come. Jan's preferred method of hunting was to sit and watch from a tree stand, which is a ladder we put in the woods and sits about 15 feet high. She would sit up there with a bow and arrow and wait to take a shot when the deer came. Around 5 p.m. that day, she told Bruce she was leaving, and she made it to her tree stand by about 5:30. The forest she was going to be hunting in was one she was very familiar with, and it was not very remote. There were houses just outside the woods, there were some agricultural areas, and her nephew actually went to high school just a mile north of these streets. But from the tree stand where she was sitting, all she could see around her was trees. Shortly after Jan sat down, she started texting with one of her friends on her BlackBerry. Periodically, she put her head up and looked at deer, weren't any, and she went back to texting. The whole time this is happening, Jan can hear birds and crickets and squirrels, all the sounds of the forest all around her. A little after 6 p.m., a texting conversation with her friend reached a natural conclusion, so she went back and just kind of sitting on the tree stand looking around. By about 6:20 p.m., she still hadn't seen any deer, and she was starting to get bored, so she decided she would take a selfie. She picked up her BlackBerry, she took the selfie, and as soon as she was done, she became aware that the forest had suddenly gone completely quiet. The squirrels, the birds, the crickets, just complete silence. And she knew, as a hunter, the only time this happened was when a large predator was in the area and all the other animals were quiet. But Jan would later say there was just something different about this silence. It was so sudden and so complete that it scared her. And she wound up sending another text message to a friend she'd been texting earlier that said the woods just went completely silent. Very odd. As soon as Jan hit send on that text message and lowered her phone, she immediately became aware of something about 20 feet away in the tree that was right across from her. And she said it was the most unusual and terrifying thing she had ever seen. Moving left to right through the branches was this thing that she described as like a visual distortion. She said it was like looking across pavement on a really hot day and seeing that mirage, except this one looked like it was alive, like it had mass, like it was a see-through person that had been wrapped in a saran wrap. And so Jan thinks it's a floater in her eyes, and so she rubs her eyes, and when she looks up, this thing has now moved down a branch closer to her and has stopped, like it's perched on the branch, staring at her, and Jan's horrified, but she knows she wants to document it, so she grabs her phone, and she raises it up, and she takes a picture on her BlackBerry right as this thing kind of disappears behind the tree and vanishes. Just seconds after this thing disappeared, all the sounds in the forest came back. The birds, the squirrels, the crickets, it was all back to normal, but Jan was really shaken up because she just could not make sense of what she just saw. So she just continued to stare in the general direction of where this thing was for several minutes until finally she felt like it was safe again, at which point she brought her phone up to look at the picture she had taken. When she looked at it, it looked like a blurry mess, and so she thought, oh, I blew it, I put my hand over it, or my hair got in the way of it, or something. But at the same time, she's thinking to herself, but my hair didn't get in the way of it, and I very clearly held it out in front of me and know that I was looking at my phone when I took it, and I had a clear shot of this thing, so I don't really understand how this photo got so messed up. But after looking at the picture for a little while, she started to kind of laugh at herself at the idea that she'd just seen a saran wrap person running through the treetops. You know, she just felt like that didn't happen. It must have been in my head. And as for this picture, I probably just blocked the lens, and that's it. That night, when Jan got back to her house, she did not tell her husband Bruce about what happened to her in the tree stand, because again, she's telling herself it was all in her head. They have dinner, they come out and sit down in the living room, and they're both on their phones, and they're just kind of scrolling through the internet and their emails. And at some point, Bruce reacts to something he's reading. He makes a sound. And Jan hears it and says, oh, what are you looking at? And he said, you know, I just got a really interesting email from our nephew, the one that goes to school down the road. He said that today they were outside for band practice, and at some point all of them turned to look at the forest, and there was a bright circular light that was kind of hovering in the forest. And I guess they all stared at it for about 5 or 10 seconds, and then at some point the light kind of went back into the forest, and they didn't know what to make of it. And I guess one of his classmates said that the year before, the exact same thing happened, and it apparently scared their instructor so badly that they canceled rehearsal and went inside because of it. As Jan is listening to her husband read this email, she's sitting up, her heart is racing, and as soon as he finishes, she says, what time did he say that happened? Bruce picked up how intensely she was asking him. So he looked at the email, looked back at his wife, and was like, it was between 7:50 and 8. Why? At this point, Jan revealed everything that had happened to her while she was hunting, seeing that visual distortion in the trees that looked like a figure of some kind. And she would tell him that the forest she was in was the same one their nephew was claiming to have seen this circular light floating inside of. She told him she tried to take a picture of the thing she saw, but the picture didn't come out. But her husband, who is an optical physicist and therefore an expert at analyzing a picture, said, "Here, let me take a look at it." As soon as he looked at the image, the first thing he asked her was, "Well, did your hair get in front of the lens?" And she said, "No, I was holding it about a foot away from my head, and my hair was in a ponytail and a ball cap, so that can't be my hair." And so he looked at it again, and he asked her, "Well, did you put your finger over the lens, maybe?" And she said, "Yeah, I might have. I don't think I did, but it's certainly possible." And so, not really thinking much of this picture, he decides before giving the phone back to just check the resolution of the image, because whenever he would examine a picture, that was something he would do, and he discovered an anomaly. It turns out Jan's BlackBerry was only capable of taking pictures in 3 distinct resolutions. Basically, the size of the image could only come in small, medium, or large. And this picture she had taken of this thing she saw in the trees was a resolution size that was not small, medium, or large. It was some random size that the phone was actually not capable of producing. And so he asked his wife, did you manipulate your resolution settings? And she said, "No, I don't even know how to do that." So Bruce looked at the other couple of pictures she had taken that day, and all of those fell into the small, medium, or large resolution size. It was just this one picture that was a total anomaly. And so Bruce was suddenly really intrigued by this image and by his wife's story, and so he continued to study the image, and he kept asking his wife questions about, how she was positioned in the tree stand, and where the sun was, and how far away this thing was, and everything about the whole layout. And eventually Bruce started conducting experiments to see if he could duplicate this image his wife had created, and he got pretty scientific about it, and he could not duplicate it. Ultimately, because Bruce trusts his wife did not alter the photo in any way, and he trusts his wife as being truthful about what she experienced in the tree stand, what she saw, and based on his years of being an optical physicist, Bruce believes whatever was in the trees distorted this image. That even if she had put her finger over the lens, which he doesn't think she did, and she doesn't think she did, the picture resolution was altered in such a way that something had to have an effect on it. There was a third-party effect on this picture. If you're interested in reading all of Bruce's scientific findings about this picture, I have included his write-up that he posted online in the sources below. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer to give the like button a hot pocket, but instead of letting it stand in the microwave for 2 minutes...
Alright, I'm not going to do any pranks or anything, so I'm going to turn the camera off for a little bit, and then I'll resume once I get to a decent area. I just have to get a wireless charger, because for some reason my phone doesn't want to charge. It's like the moisture detection. It's very strange, but it's a long story. I will be back in about 10 minutes, but you guys won't even know, obviously. Alright, so I ended up just picking this thing up. And hopefully it will be pretty good. I'm not sure what even happened with my phone. It's like a weird coincidence, because I had to get this user interface update, which is why in that previous video I did a turnaround on some random dead end road, because I was waiting for my phone to finish updating, because it was a forced update. I couldn't even, at most I could wait 1 hour before updating it, and then 8 hours something after I updated that, the charger won't work, so now I can't charge my phone. And I do have insurance on the phone, but you have to pay money. It's I don't know, it's not even worth going in at the moment, so hopefully it resolves on its own, and if not, I don't know, I'll just have to go into Verizon. But either way, I'm not against buying wireless chargers, and I did order one online because it was so cheap, and it was a brand that they sell at home. So I saved like 15 bucks, or not 15, but like 10. And that's a weird port. I've never seen a port like this. I thought it was going to be a Type-C, but it's not a Type-C. But anyways, I'll head back on the road in about 2 minutes. All right.
Whoa! Someone will go missing, there'll be an extensive search, there's no trace of them, and then they're found like miles and Now, one man, David Politis, who's a former police detective, he began researching these very strange disappearances inside of national parks. It started when a park ranger actually approached him.
It so good before, now it's not working. I don't know why.
You should look into it because you're a former detective. And so after looking into it, he discovered that there were so many oddities around many of these strange disappearances. And he saw there was many overlaps and similarities that he really dove into it. And he's examined thousands of these strange cases. By his count, 10,000 plus hours of research. He's written 4 books. They're all under the name Missing 411. If you Google Missing 411, you'll find a plethora of information about these cases. He has 2 documentaries out. And so David, while he doesn't actually take a stance as to, what's going on,
I apologize for all that. I think it worked good earlier, and hopefully now it's good. I don't know.
Is basically led to believe that something is hunting humans in North America inside of national parks. It is fascinating, it is terrifying, and I've picked out 5 of the most bizarre cases that I've come across inside of Missing 4. Before we get into those 5 stories though, if this is the type of content that you're interested in, the strange, dark, and mysterious that I've kind of promised in this video, well, that's what my channel's all about. And I post 3 to 4 times a week. And so that's your style and you like that type of content, if you could, please gently lambast the like button and then please turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into the stories. On Father's Day weekend, 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Martin, his brother, his father, and his grandfather headed up to the Smoky Mountains to go camping. This was a family tradition on Father's Day, and they were really excited about it. They get to the same campsite they always used, they set up, they had a wonderful first night, camp out, and the next day, another camper in the area happened to walk by and saw that Dennis and his brother were playing there, and so this camper had kids as well, and he asked Dennis's father, hey, would it be okay if I brought my kids by? They're the same age as your sons, and they can just play together. Dennis's father says, sure, bring them down. And so the man goes, gets his kids, they come back, and before long, all the kids are playing hide and seek. Now, Dennis's father would say that he had an eye on Dennis the whole time. He was just at a distance watching his son to make sure he didn't get lost. And so at one point, all the kids are hiding from the parents. And, at some point, the parents say, okay, show yourselves. And all the kids, except for Dennis, show themselves. And Dennis's father has watched Dennis go behind a particular tree. He watched him do it. He was watching the whole time. And so when they said, come on out, and he didn't come out, he actually wasn't that concerned because he knew exactly where his son was. And then after a few moments, he yelled to his son directly and starts walking over and says, Dennis, come out, Dennis, I know you're behind the tree. And when he finally got over there, Dennis wasn't there. Dennis's father immediately starts running off into the woods, screaming for his son. And he actually ends up running 2 miles up the Appalachian Trail, just hollering for his son, and he can't find him. And then the rest of the family had broken up and was searching the area because they're thinking, like, he couldn't have gone very far. He was literally just here. And Dennis's father had said before, like, I watched him go behind the tree. I watched him. I don't know where he is, but I watched him go behind the tree. So they're searching everywhere, and Dennis is gone. So a huge search, in fact, the biggest search in park history ensues. 1,500 searches that included the Army Green Berets, so the Special Forces got involved. They are combing a 60 square mile plot. They're looking everywhere, and there is nothing. There's no trace. There's no scent. There is nothing connected to Dennis Martin anywhere. And so they go back to Dennis's father, and they're like, you have to tell us what you saw. Again, this doesn't add up. If you were looking at the tree, and he was right there, how is it that he has just vanished into the air? But no one knew. That was it. No one knows what happened. There's no closure. He's just gone, and they never knew what happened to him. Years later, when David Paulides was doing his research for Missing 411 and was researching the Dennis Martin case, he interviewed other families that had been at the campground at the same time that Dennis had gone missing. And one of those families was the Key family. And they had asked a park ranger where they could go on the campground where they might be able to see some bears. And so the park ranger obviously said, be careful, but you can go over here to this section of the campground and you might see a bear. And so they head over there and they're looking for bears. And one of their children hears a scream, or thinks he hears a scream, and kind of directs the family to look in the direction of the scream. And from their vantage point, they could see up onto the side of this mountain where there was, call it sparse trees all over the mountain, so you could kind of see in between the trees. And they saw what looked like a bear running along the mountainside, but with something slung over its shoulder. Except the interesting thing about this bear was the father was quoted as saying that it didn't really act like a bear. It was acting more like a human the way it was running. It looked, hairy and like an animal, but it was running and dodging between trees. It was holding this what looked like a child over its shoulder. It acted almost like a human. And so you have a bear man that has been spotted by the Key family, and they bring this up to the investigators that are looking into the Dennis Martin case. And obviously the Dennis Martin investigators, they don't take this seriously. They think that they're just saying some ridiculous thing for attention or whatever it is. So it never really was entered into the case with Dennis Martin. It wasn't until the Missing 411 cases that it was ever connected. But there really was a family that claims to have seen a bear man carrying a child about an hour after Dennis Martin had gone missing in the same area where Dennis Martin had gone missing. In the spring of...
Sorry guys, it's like a really bumpy road, and I do not have the best setup right now. This is like my second time recording while driving like this. And yeah, it's very bumpy. Alright. And then I also have to worry about the camera like overheating, because I don't want to record in like awful quality, and like the GoPro is already bad enough as it is. So like yesterday, like the quality should have been way better than it was. Like you should have been able to like see all the trees clearly, and like everything should have been pretty high res, but I guess you just can't rely on GoPros. Like, I don't know. It's very like inconsistent. Maybe it was because I had auto exposure turned on. it's just like overworking itself with the trees. But either way, hopefully this looks better, I think. It must be auto exposure, but I don't know. I still have to get like a Canon or something. And
1852, 2-year-old Keith Parkins was playing with his siblings outside of his grandfather's ranch in Ritter, Oregon. And when the kids were all called in to have lunch, Keith was nowhere to be found. And so the siblings and the family went out and did a cursory search looking for Keith. And when nothing turns up, they call in authorities and a full-fledged search is launched for Keith. There's no sign, there's nothing. And 4 miles away from the ranch, they find, several hours later, some footprints that look like they might belong to a 2-year-old. And they start tracking those footprints, and they go on for miles and miles, and then they just kind of stop. And it wouldn't be until the next day, 12 miles away from the ranch, that they would ultimately find Keith. Surprisingly, Keith, who had disappeared with not enough clothing to be out in sub-zero temperatures with snow on the ground, and being 2 years old, he wasn't prepared for a night out. He was found alive, face down, 12 miles away. His jacket and his hat had been stacked neatly next to him, and he had scratch marks all over his face, but he was unhurt. When asked, what happened, he's 2 years old, he had said a cat scratched him, and he kept repeating that a cat had scratched him. That was the only thing that he could articulate. No one knew how a 2-year-old, in the span of 20 hours, could have moved in the middle of the night 12 miles away. Les Stroud, who's a very accomplished outdoorsman, he's the star, he is Survivor Man, he actually, because of this case, went out and tried to actually cover the distance in the allotted time. 20 hours to cover this 12 miles. And he couldn't do it. And he even said, it's not possible for a 2-year-old to have covered this distance, let alone survived the exposure to the elements in the time that he was out there. But somehow he did. And, years and years later, Keith was interviewed, because now he's a grown man, he was interviewed about what happened, and he has no idea. He has no memory of it. At the end of 1973, 19-year-old Charles McCullough, who was an amateur photographer, had been doing a West Coast tour of the United States, going to all the different national parks to photograph beautiful scenery. And by January of 1974, he was in Oregon and wanted to go to Crater Lake, where he wanted to take pictures of Crater Lake. So he asked his friend, who had an all-terrain vehicle, to take him out to Crater Lake, because his van, which was this VW beat-up old van, it couldn't have made it out that far. And as his friend is driving him out to Crater Lake, Charles says to him, kind of jokingly, if you don't hear from me in a couple of days, file a missing person report. Sure enough, a couple of days later, when Charles doesn't show up, that friend does file a missing person report, and an extensive search is conducted at Crater Lake to find Charles. There's no sign of Charles. There's nothing. There's no anything about Charles. And his father actually flew out there and stayed for several months, just constantly searching the area. Found nothing. So nothing is found. So a year later, a couple of backpackers were hiking the area around Crater Lake, and they get lost. They take a wrong turn, and they're well off the trailhead, and they discover a backpack. In the backpack, they found a strange-looking Volkswagen key that anyone that knew Charles McCullough knew that he had this strange key. And so when they found it, it was a distinctive key. So when they gave it to police, it turned out that it was Charles McCullough's backpack. So investigators went out and started looking in the area that this backpack was found, which was 12 miles off the trailhead. So this is well off the trailhead. And near the backpack, they find what remained of Charles McCullough. So they found his pants unbuttoned and on a log, as if he was sitting on the log and then just disappeared into the ground, but his pants were still there. Sticking out of the pants were his socks, no shoes, and in the socks were his feet bones. There was no jacket, there was no upper portion of his skeleton. 12 feet away, they find a portion of his skull, and that is the last thing they find of Charles McCullough. And ultimately, it was determined that he died of natural causes. His family was not prepared to accept that, however, when you look at some of the circumstances. He was missing his jacket, he's missing his boots, he's missing his photography equipment, his head is detached from his body. He He was also 12 miles off the trailhead, and when he went missing, there had been approximately 5 to 7 feet of snow that had dumped in the area. So how did he move 12 miles off the trailhead in 7 feet of snow, especially when you consider he was not an outdoorsy type, and even when he got dropped off by his friend that drove him out there, he even said later on that he felt like Charles was very ill-equipped for the environment he was going into. But at the end of the day, it was left as, sorry, he went missing and he died of natural causes. That was that. Bart Schleyer was a famous outdoorsman and hunter. He was just one of those people that you could drop into any environment and he's not only going to survive, he's going to thrive. A testament to that would be he spent months in Siberia tracking and catching Siberian tigers. He was like a world-renowned tiger tracker. He's just like this super rugged, super confident outdoorsman. In September of 2004, Bart books a float plane to take him 175 miles north into the Yukon Territory in Canada for him to go hunt moose on his own for 3 weeks. He had all the right equipment, he was obviously extremely capable, and no one thought twice about it. When he got dropped off, he told the pilot, meet me back here in 3 weeks. And so off he went. The plane leaves and comes back 3 weeks later, and there's no Bart. Now the pilot knew Bart was like a god in the wilderness, and so he wasn't really concerned, but he went over to where he had been told his campsite would be, and he found the campsite. And it looked like someone was still living there. It didn't look like it had been destroyed at all. And then near his campsite, he found a dry bag, which looked like it had an indent on it, where someone might have been sitting on it up against a tree. And then next to the tree was his bow and some arrows. And it looked like an area where a hunter might have been sitting to call in moose. But there was no Bart. Near the dry bag and the bow and arrow, they found Bart's teeth and a couple of shards of bone. Initially, the thought is, well, a large predator must have snuck up on Bart and eaten him. Except there's a couple of huge problems with that theory. One, Bart, his friends at least would say, and people that knew him would say, he would never get snuck up on by a large predator. He was so accomplished in the wilderness, like he was always a step ahead of everything around him. So the idea that he would just be sitting there one day and a bear would just happen to sneak up on him is pretty far-fetched. Also, in the area where his teeth and some of his bones were found, there was no sign of what they call a death struggle, where you're fighting for your life, you're smashing into everything. There's none of that. There's no marking on the ground or in the surrounding areas that a large predator had attacked him. Also, his camp had food out in the open, and if a large predator had come through like a bear after it finished with Bart, it would have raided the campsite, and it didn't. And so the way this was left was he was attacked and eaten by a predator. But nobody believes that because that wouldn't happen to Bart, and the circumstances around his campsite didn't believe that. In 2002, Christopher Tompkins was working as a surveyor, and he was assigned to this 4-man survey crew that was working in Harris County, Georgia. And they were walking along this road spaced about 50 feet apart, all 4 of them. And Chris was the last one in line. And the third one in line would later tell investigators and police that as they were walking along the road, he would periodically turn around to just, for a quick second, make sure Chris was So after this huge investigation, they don't find any sign of it. And that's it. They're just like, yeah, it's gone. Now they did find 9 months later, they found this other near a swamp 900 yards away, but it didn't provide any more clarity on what happened to it. However, if you look at the pile of loose change and things that were in his pockets that were on the road, it indicates that it's something that he may have been upside down. Think about the entirety of all of these strange stories, where the idea being someone hunting humans. Just picture in your head Chris Tompkins walking along and something flipping him upside down, dumping the contents out, and then being gone in a matter of a minute where no one can see it. These 5 stories are just a fraction of the literal thousands of others that are covered in the Missing 411 series. And while many people believe that all of the cases of Missing 411 and any others that ultimately are considered strange inside of these national parks have a rational explanation, even if we don't know what it is. Whereas another group believes that this Missing 411 phenomenon is an indication that something is hunting humans in the national parks across North America. Some say Bigfoot, some say aliens, some say something else. But paranormal is certainly the other camp in terms of trying to explain away what these strange disappearances are from, what's causing them. Whether or not we ever find a definitive conclusion remains to be seen, but I would love to hear what you think is going on inside of these strange cases like Missing 411, whether it's a rational explanation or some other option. But I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments. And
Say sure. To be mean, I think we just we'll take a quick look around and give the typical journalist comments and we'll leave. We go inside and I show him the basics, doing so in a way that we ended back up the entrance of the suite. And this whole time he's not saying much. Is at peace. Growing up in a Boston suburb during the 80s was rough. I came up in a neighborhood that was rife with shady activity. It was the kind of place that changed when the sun went down. Sketchy streets and arterial alleyways that looked sinister when shrouded in darkness. My dad was an introverted workaholic, and the subsequent loneliness driving my mom to the bottom. I was rebellious, angry, and without income. It was the perfect storm. Naturally, I fell into petty crime. School was a joke, a glorified daycare for hopeless kids with no future in anything but prison or morgue. We were extremely disrespectful to the faculty. On more than one occasion, a member of the teaching staff was assaulted by a student. But there was one teacher who seemed to be an exception. He was someone who the kids never talked back to. Someone who had that natural air of authority about him. His name was Mr. Metzger. A few teachers at our school were a mess. Fresh college graduates who were only maybe a year older than the kids in our class. A couple of functioning alcoholics who smelled like vodka at 8:30 each morning. Shirt buttons undone with loose, tacky Walmart ties, complete with 5-day stubble. But not Mr. Metzger. He was always clean-shaven, his thinning gray hair combed over a bald patch on the crown of his head. He commanded respect. One Friday evening, my buddies and me were smoking cigarettes, cruising in a battered old Ford when the subject of Mr. Metzger came up. He was a war veteran, right? Dude was a Marine or some crap, got a Silver Star for killing like 10 enemy soldiers in an ambush or something. One said. I called BS. The other retorted. Not everyone who served was some stone-cold killer. My uncle was in the Army motor pool, sitting in a fired shot. Nah, man. Metzger's hardcore. He broke a kid's jaw during a fight a few years back. The kid's jaw was already broken. If Mr. Metzger was in the Marines, he certainly never talked about it. Later that night, we pulled up to a small, stucco house on the outskirts of Jamaica Plain. It was pretty unassuming, not the usual middle-class housing we targeted for burglaries, but my buddy in the back seat insisted. You sure this is the right place? Dude, for the last time, yes. The guy buys and sells auto parts. There's always a buttload of cash stashed inside. I'm telling you, this would be a huge score for us. We parked around the block, scanning the area before we approached the house. Holding out bandanas and balaclavas, we used them to obscure our faces from any potential witnesses. It was quiet out, almost pitch black if it wasn't for the dim fluorescent glow of orange street lamps. Breaking into the garage was easy. The rotting wood of a side door gave way from around the old rusty lock, and just like that, we were inside. But the interior of the damp, dark garage held no car parts, no sign of any mechanical work at all. I shot our insistent friend a scornful look. We should have just left right then and there, but we were young, foolish, and arrogant. We didn't want to walk away empty-handed. At the door to the main house, we listened for any sign of activity inside, and it was silent. I gulped, took hold of the door handle, and pulled. A short corridor led to a side room which was evidently serving as a kind of office space, with books and paperwork piled on an old desk. I crept inside while my buddies searched the rest of the ground floor for valuables. It was searching the office that I began to notice a few things about the person who lived here. Despite being time-worn and dilapidated, the room was incredibly orderly and neat. The contents of shelves were immaculately arranged, with one wall displaying a ragged-looking flag, red and blue with a yellow star in the center. I had no idea what country it was from, but I did get a feeling I'd seen it before somewhere. A section of wall was decorated with framed newspaper clippings, and they were almost impossible to read in the darkness, but a shaft of pale moonlight creeping in through a grimy window drew my eye to one word in particular: Vietnam. Our late-night burglaries were always heart-pounding affairs, but an unfamiliar terror began to claw at my guts as I quietly slid open one of the desk drawers. There, set next to the dull metal of a Colt 45, was some kind of necklace. Bumpy, wrinkled shapes, haphazardly strung together with a piece of cord. I squinted in the darkness, reaching inside to run a fingertip along one of the furrowed clumps. They felt textured, desiccated. I had a solid lump of fear in my throat, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end by the time I realized what they were. They were human ears. I started to back out of the room, feeling the raw, palm-sweating terror coursing through me as my mind began to race. We need to get out of here. We need to get out of here right now. I could hear the creak of old floorboards growing closer to me by the time I saw someone rush past the window. I stopped, peering into the street outside in time to see another shape, hurtling past the grubby pane of glass at full sprint. It was my buddies. I was alone with whoever was creeping up on me in the corridor behind. I turned in time to see him, standing at the threshold blocking my escape. I'll never forget the sound of the rhythmic inhale and exhale of air through his nostrils. The breaths sounded ragged, almost shaky, relaying the absolute fury and contempt that the figure felt for me. He stepped forward, his face momentarily bathed in a dim light, features that were twisted by wrath, pale blue eyes that seethed with a predatory glare. It was Mr. Metzger. He lunged. I was fast, but he was faster, stronger, and possibly so. We struggled, grunting and growling as his rough, callous hands wrapped themselves around my neck. It was a practiced maneuver. It seemed instinctual to him. To my absolute horror, the black bandana that disguised me began to loosen, slipping down a little as we fought. If he sees my face, I'm dead. Blind panic set in. I threw myself forward, my forehead smashing into one of his eye sockets. His grip loosened. I thrashed and kicked as he cried out in pain, freeing myself just enough to be able to pull myself away from him and make a dash for the garage. I burst out of the house, tearing down the street as fast as my legs could carry me. Any second now, he's going to aim that Colt 45 and blow my head off. I couldn't bring myself to look back. I didn't want to see him fire the shot that would end me. Dude was a Marine, killed 10 people. I'm going to be the 11th. Oh God, help me, I'm going to be the 11th. The shot never came. Somehow I managed to reach the end of the street, ducking into one of the garbage-strewn alleys that meander through the neighborhood like rat runs. I almost punched my cowardly friends when I finally caught up with them. They left me alone with that maniac. Left me alone to die. Are you kidding me? You saw what was inside that house. We got out at the moment we saw what was in there, one said, attempting to defend himself. You could have warned me, man. You just up and left me there alone. The thing in the TV room was made of hair. Human hair. My other buddy finally spoke up. His cigarette burned until the hanging ash seemed to defy gravity. Shut up, that was not human hair. I don't know what it was. Then tell him about the other thing, dude. Go ahead, tell him. My other buddies sounded almost distraught at this point. I don't want to talk about that. It almost sounded childlike, his cynicism and bravado stripped away. They never did talk about what they saw. The botched burglary was never mentioned again. I dropped out of high school shortly after, following my buddies deeper into a life of criminality until an arrest for grand theft got me 6 months in prison. After my release, I turned my life around. I got a job, earned my GED, and attended a local community college to study home improvement. I live a quiet life now. I'm a father and a husband. I eat my wife's cooking, I watch the Red Sox, I go to bed at 11. I'm a different person now. But just last week in the Home Depot over near Southie, I thought I recognized an elderly man shuffling among the aisles. I followed curiously for a minute or two, keeping my distance until the man turned and locked eyes with me. I know you, he said, unsmiling. You're one of my old high school students. Yeah, JB High, class 86. It's our history, right? I felt that old familiar dread permeating my guts. That's right, he said, his cold blue eyes studying me intently. You look like you landed on your feet. Not bad for a dropout. Yeah, I got myself together in the end. Teenagers, right? I forced a weak smile. Right. A solemn look on his face as his tone dropped a little. Everyone deserves a second chance, even if they did bad things in their youth. There was a weight behind his words. My palms grew damp against the plastic push bar of the cart. Well, nice seeing you again, Mr. Metzger. I'm kind of amazed you even recognized me, I said, beginning to wheel my cart away, trying to hide my anxiety. Oh, he replied, an almost wolfish grin on his withered old face as I saw the same predatory glare in his eyes that I did 30 years ago. I never forget a face. The education system here in the UK is a little different than the US. You see, we don't have a middle school. We don't have that kind of social buffer that separates children from young adults, so when you're 11 years old, you're suddenly dropped into a campus that includes larger, intimidating teenagers. As bad as it sounds, leaving the nurturing environment of primary school and entering the unforgiving, hormone-saturated world of secondary school is daunting to say the least. Granted, I was quite a shy child, but seeing all these spotty-faced, deep-voiced, hairy miscreants dragging their knuckles through the corridors, it was terrifying. They were like monsters. I didn't understand the things they did, or the things they said. I remember just trying to keep my head down, try not to get noticed by any potential bullies. And so, that's where the story begins. With myself as a frightened, quiet boy in a place that made me dread having to wake up in the morning, homework, being popular, avoiding trouble, I thought that was as bad as it was going to get for me. I was wrong. The headmaster of the school was named Dr. Sylvester. He wasn't a medical doctor. He had earned the title in some lesser field, but he went by doctor nonetheless. He struck me as a cold man. His welcoming speech to the year 7s made secondary school seem like an ordeal we had to endure than an experience that would enrich us. The speech was emotionless, with subordinate teachers lining the old school hall like prison camp guards.
or if anyone watching this is like wondering why I just drove back and forth, possibly, it's because I was gonna drive somewhere, but it's so foggy, it's not even worth it. So I'm just gonna drive in a different direction now. So basically, it's like a change of plans, and that's the best and only real explanation.
The man was somewhat of a mystery to me, but then everything at the tender age of 11 is a mystery. Every little aspect of life threatens and frightens. I remember feeling an immense pressure at the time. Pressure to succeed, pressure to conform. I was told not to question things, that adults always had our best interests at heart. If only that were true. I recall it being a brisk autumn morning. Leafless, skeletal trees and piles of rotting leaf litter line the pavements. We had French class at first period, by far the most loathed of the subjects I took. Not because I disliked the language. I was actually pretty good at it. The problem was the woman who was engulfed in flame, a walking actual drill. But there was something different about this one. Something which wafted through the corridors towards and washed over the already nervous children. We could smell smoke. Something was actually burning. The most terrifying memory of the event wasn't the fire itself. It wasn't the ominous smell of burning plastic or the cries of frightened students who were beginning to panic. It was the look on the presiding teachers' faces when they realized the very real danger we were in. At that age, adults seemed invincible, like they can solve every problem and then some. I had never in my short life seen a look of terror so pure on a grown-up's face. It chilled me to the bone. With anxious voices, the teachers herded us to the nearest exit. The intensity of the smoke increases as we moved. Pouring out of the building, we could see the far wing of the school building as it burned, wildfires dancing among thick black smoke. And then the screams began. Children turned in the direction of the building's burning section, pointing and screeching as a figure emerged.
Oh yeah, like another reason why I'm not like gonna go hiking right now is because it wasn't supposed to start raining until like after 2, and it already started raining like by 12:30, even before. So that's the reason also.
From the conflagration. It was engulfed in flame, a walking inferno whose cries of pains were burned up before they could leave charred lips. And then there were sirens, flashing blue lights, and men that wore fluorescent uniforms. Paramedics tried to stifle the blaze on the burning man. The sight of his charred, smoking corpse had children in tears as teachers barked at them to look away. The looking away didn't help. Even when I closed my eyes and put my fingers in my ears, I could still smell it. I could still smell the burning flesh. The school actually closed down for a week while the damage could be assessed. Local authorities offered to pay for trauma counseling for the entire teaching staff and student body. Our class, along with our respective parents, attended a group session at a nearby community center. I didn't understand any of it. I didn't understand why we would want to all sit around and talk about something so terrible. Why we all weren't just at home, trying to be happy, trying to forget. It's terrible to say so, but I considered the time off as a sort of special holiday. I was allowed to play video games for as long as I wanted. My parents even bought me a new game. I could tell they thought I was upset, but they were trying to be good parents. I just didn't question any of it. Like I said, I just thought it was better to try to forget. Why would I want to remember the sight of that burning man climbing from the debris? Why would anyone want to remember that? After a few days, the school sent a letter out to all the families involved. The cause of the fire was said to be an electrical fault, a freak surge that shorted a kitchen power outlet and set fire to a broken refrigerator. However, I did notice something about my parents around that time. When I was out of the room, I would hear them talking in hushed tones. They were discussing something they didn't want me to hear, something secret. I was a curious kid, sure, but I had no desire to eavesdrop. I was acutely aware that there were things in the world I really didn't want to know about. Some things are better left as secrets. It took 10 years for the truth to come out. One evening, whilst sitting down for a home-cooked family meal, We started to discuss my school days. It was nothing in particular at first, but somehow the subject of the fire came up. Just a passing comment, nothing shocking or abrasive, yet my parents reacted rather strangely. My dad put down his cutlery and cleared his throat, giving my mom a long, serious look. She did the same, sighing before she turned to me and spoke. "We hope you understand that we did what we thought was best at the time. Set fire to the school, tried to burn it down. With all the children inside," Mom interjected. She brought her hand to her mouth and her voice began to crack, fresh tears twinkling in the corner of her eyes. My dad just hushed her, comforting her softly before he continued. "You see, Mr. Sylvester, the head teacher, that wasn't his name at all. Before then, he had never held a teaching position in his life. His name was Bernard Lee. Bernard Lee began an affair with a woman and wanted to escape his family. He wanted a new life. He wanted a clean slate. So one night, while his wife and children were sleeping, he doused their home in petrol and set it ablaze." My mom was sobbing at this point, tears rolling down her cheeks, but she still managed a few final words. "But unlike you, son, who was so to hide the raw fear in her voice, I don't feel comfortable." "Shut up, girl."
I don't know if you can see the mountains up low. It's a pretty cool view. That's the highlight over here. But can't see the mountains that well. But you should be able to do better than it seems like it's showing. But I'm gonna stop recording for now because of my the SD is only like the standard SD. I have to get like a larger one, even though I'll probably just get a new camera. But anyways,
Girl, we thank the boy with the big mouth later. This is a collective punishment. Mr. Schwenko hissed, taking a seat at his desk. We waited, the tension thick in the air as we dreaded to think what Mr. Schwenko had in store for us. We'd never seen him as angry as he was now. Some people even said they'd smelled alcohol in his breath some days. I felt a knot of fear in my guts as I pictured the morbid newspaper headlines that might follow the next day. "The most important time of life happened before any of you were even born," Mr. Schwenko began. "It was the 25th of April, 1986, the day the entire world ended for my town. I had recently returned from Moscow after studying nuclear physics at the university there. I was glad to be home. It was the start of a new life for me. I had a girlfriend. I hoped to marry once I found work. Pripyat was a beautiful place. Forests nearby, streams for fishing. We were happy there. That evening was warm with a clear, cloudless sky. Above Pripyat was a ceiling of stars, a blanket of celestial bodies that you could lose yourself in for hours. But that same night, an accident that occurred near our town changed my life forever. An accident that occurred at..." I knew what he was going to say before he said it. The words were on my lips before he even uttered them. "A Chernobyl nuclear power plant. There was a saying in my homeland, we pretend to work and the government pretends to pay us." The class could see the sadness in our teacher's eyes as he spoke. It was like that back then. Communism had destroyed people's desire to better themselves. Years of incompetence and corruption meant that there was a design flaw in one of the new reactors. When the safety test began, the reactor was like a loaded gun, just waiting to go off. So when the control rods were removed to raise power again, he calmly looked over to the disrespectful jock, narrowing his eyes as he leaned into his desk. Boom! Mr. Schwenko's roar sent the jock reeling in his seat. The rest of our class didn't fare too well either. We were gripped, hanging on to our teacher's every word. But what no one knew, thanks to years of error and cover-up, was that there was a fatal flaw in the reactor design that made it unstable at low power levels. As power levels were lowered in preparation for the test, they dropped too low, and the reactor ground to a halt. Meanwhile, unseen, a dangerous hotspot was building deep in the reactor. 2 huge explosions that shook the earth beneath our feet. Every man, woman, and child in Pripyat heard the bangs. But we had no idea what it was. Some of the off-duty workers feared the worst, but none of us could have fathomed that what was about to unfold was the worst nuclear disaster in history. I felt the shockwave as I looked towards at the power station. A pillar of smoke rose up in the clear night sky, and though the inky blackness of the night I made out twinkles of flame in the distance. Some of the people in my apartment block thought war had broken out. Then myself and the people of Pripyat watched in awe and terror as the huge stream of ionizing radiation shot into the heavens, lighting up the night with a hideous blue glow. We thought the world was ending. For us, it certainly was. People were terrified beyond belief, but I must admit, I found myself smiling as I looked out into the night. It was titanic, like looking at the face of God, a gargantuan mass of pure energy. It was beautiful. The melancholic look never left Mr. Schwenko's eyes, even if a small, nostalgic grin did curl his lips. But that was only the start of it. What came after, both as a result of the accident and of the government's mishandling of it, was much more horrific. The teacher never took his eyes off the jock, as if every single word was directed at him. It must have been torturous. It certainly was for the rest of us. We were forced to listen, and we had no escape. Did you know that they bust a troupe of entertainers to keep some of the nearer villagers calm as they died of radiation poisoning? Let me describe to you one such performance. Mrs. Schwenko began relishing the disturbed looks on our faces. A beautiful ballerina, dancing her final dance. Strands of her blonde hair floated to the floor as she twirled. I saw blood leaking from her nostrils, down her cheeks as it seeped from her ears. When she finished, the children ran to her with flowers, their hair and teeth already starting to fall out. The generator stalled, and for several months we were plunged into darkness. To my complete and utter horror, I saw the flowers and the children glowing in the dark. There were a few gasps around the room. One of the girls in the back row was sobbing quietly into a sleeve of her sweater. The cleanup involved the work of 30,000 people, continued the teacher. There are less people in this town. Think of that. 30,000 people. They called them liquidators, a disgusting euphemism coined by a man too cowardly to call them what they were. The condemned. You know what it's like, boy? Have you had to look a friend in the eye and tell him to walk towards his own painful death? Schwenko growled towards the jock. You looked at me like you would have no problem, as long as it would have saved your own skin. 4 million people suffer today from something that happened 30 years ago. 4 million. He stood up, walking slowly towards the desk that sat the now terrified jock. And you think this is funny, yes? The jock shook his head violently, still too terrified to speak. His eyes begged for mercy. Yes, you laughed. You think that seeing children being burned from the inside out dying the most painful death imaginable, never knowing why or how they were being murdered by something they couldn't even see. You think this is a joke, don't you? No, sir. Mr. Schwenko towered over the boy's desk, eyes wide and full of fury. We waited for him to snap, for him to beat the life out of this kid, but he just turned, walked towards the door, and unlocked it. "Class dismissed," he murmured, sinking back into his seat. I've never seen a classroom of kids move so quickly in my life. Not even on the last day of school did we tear out of the building like that. But on the way out, I slowed, stopping near Mr. Schwenko's desk and feeling the anxiety build. Mr. Schwenko? We laid eyes on him in our lives. "You can call me Mr. Witzbold. I'm be your substitute teacher for the next 2 hours." Mr. Witzbold said, writing his name in big block capitals on the chalkboard. He was well-groomed, but there was something off about him, like he possessed only an appearance of dapperness, like there was something deeply wrong below the surface. Today we'll be studying a little biology, perhaps the most fascinating of all the sciences. Mr. Witzbold, sir?" A studious-looking boy in the front row raised his hand. "This is English class, shouldn't we?" The boy cut himself off, lowering his hand nervously as the teacher stared unblinkingly at him. He didn't say a word, but we all felt the weight of that stare crush the talkative young student. "As I was saying," the teacher continued, "today we'll be studying biology, and I promise not a single one of you will find today's lesson boring. The respiratory system is perhaps one of the most complex the body possesses." Mr. Witzbold began, drawing a rough diagram of some lumps on the chalkboard. "Its function is to transfer extraneous oxygen to the body's cells via hemoglobin in the blood. Can any student tell me how long the body can survive without oxygen?" And the substitute teacher turned and faced the class now, the smile on his face somehow too wide. And we shifted silently in our seats. 3 minutes, continued Mr. Witzbold. "It takes just 3 minutes for the body to experience what is known as hypoxia. Should oxygen delivery to cells become insufficient over a prolonged period of time, the subject's brain shuts down into a comatose state in order to preserve oxygen. If a ready supply is not returned, well, complete cell shutdown occurs. However, time until expirations is even less in the vacuum of space. Back in 1971, the Soviet cosmonauts died when a system's fault caused their spacecraft to depressurize, shortly before re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. The crew died within 30 to 40 seconds, as air pressure is required to deliver oxygen to the brain. Isn't that fascinating? It wasn't a morbidly academic description